What's up everyone, I'm ATZ, and this video is going to be talking about routing and decision making in Ocarina of Time Randomizer. I've been getting questions about my routing from a lot of different people recently due to race performances, and I've shared some of my general ideas with other racers who have told me that I helped them out quite a bit. So I took a bunch of time to write down most of my thoughts and routing ideas, and decided to make a video that will address all the common things that I'm asked about, and discuss a lot of the route choices that I make in detail. This video is aimed at people who want to get started with races of Randomizer, as well as people who have already done a lot of races but want to improve their race consistency. So whether you're new to the OOT Randomizer scene or have a lot of experience, I'll do my best to help you learn something. Now, just as a disclaimer, I'll be specifically talking about the accessible rule set. If you're unsure of what exactly that means, I'll leave a link in the description below to the full rule set. I'll also be focusing on the standard race settings, which include Open Forest, Open Door of Time, all medallions to unlock the Rainbow Bridge, and just the regular item randomizer, so not key sanity or token sanity. If you tend to play using other rule sets, such as no major glitches or play on different settings, you'll still hopefully get a lot out of this video, but just be aware that the way that I value certain items or checks may be different for you. First, I'm going to talk about general tips for playing Randomizer, such as areas you should try to prioritize or avoid, and how to work on your efficiency with checks. This section will discuss many of the different routing choices you may be faced with throughout any given run, and give advice on some good ways to handle them. This part is primarily aimed at beginners, but there are a few things that you can take away from it as an experienced player too. Secondly, I'll talk about my typical opening route in Randomizer, and also include what I call the 3 phases of each seed, which are the early game, the mid game, and the late game. I change my routing pretty drastically during each of these 3 phases, so I'll discuss what each of them mean, and how I determine when it's time to shift my routing style to focus on different things. This section is intended for more advanced players and will have some data that will back up many of the decisions that I do, and hopefully shine some light on why certain areas or dungeons are better than others. Lastly, I'm going to review my run from the first accessible weekly race that happened recently. I'll walk through the full seed for the race, all the decisions I made in the run, and why I decided to make each of those decisions. Hopefully this will provide some insight on full game routing as a whole, and put everything discussed in the previous sections together. Okay, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to say up front is that I believe songs are the most important resource in Randomizer, so I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what finding certain songs can mean for your run. I weight them very highly due to the fact that they are the only randomized resource outside of dungeon medallions and stones that can always be found in fixed locations. A lot of the time, especially in the early portions of the seed, songs provide you with some direction for where you should go or help speed up your movement in the overworld. That being said, I make an effort to gather easy to reach songs whenever they're available, which includes going adult very early to get the song from the windmill. Obviously, certain songs are better than others for a variety of reasons, so this list is my ranking for each of the songs based on importance throughout the run. Keep in mind that this list will be assuming that I find them within the first hour or so. First should be no surprise, ZL. ZL gives you access to 2 new songs, one in the graveyard which requires nothing else, and one in the ice cavern which requires a bottle. ZL is also required to beat the Shadow Temple and can potentially be required to beat the Spirit and Water Temples. It also opens up fairy fountains around the world, which means that you can generally full clear an entire area on your first pass. Finding ZL later into a seed is really inconvenient because it opens up a ton of single checks around the world that just take a long time to reach. Ranks 2 through 4 are all very similar in that they're all warp songs that lead to free songs. I rank Requiem the highest because Spirit Temple is in by far the most remote location in the game out of every temple, so finding Requiem guarantees that you won't have to clear Gerudo Forest and go across all of the wasteland to actually get to the Spirit Temple. Bolero is pretty similar in that it might be your first means of being able to reach the Fire Temple and the song location, and it's also pretty far out of the way. Minuet is arguably the easiest of the 3 song locations to reach, and while it does give faster access to the Saria Song location as child as well, you're almost always going to clear out the Lost Woods anyway for all the checks that it has, so you're very close to that song location in the first place. Song of Storms early means that you get to check the well, and similar to ZL, it has a few other checks throughout the world that you can likely get on your first pass through an area. The well is also a very check-heavy area that you can full clear in only a few minutes, so if you find Song of Storms early, checking the well is almost always a good play, even if you don't have ZL or explosives to full clear it. I tend to hold off on doing the well until I've cleared most of Child in hopes that I find explosives. Prelude is very useful to find early because it just speeds up your Child section by several minutes. Epona's Song can potentially be your only means of reaching the desert, and it also helps get around the overworld as adult a bit faster. If you find Requiem though, the value of Epona's Song drops pretty heavily. Nocturne is pretty nice to get because Kakariko is usually a location you'll travel to a few times throughout the run, and it can connect to some other locations in the game such as Death Mountain. Nocturne's value is obviously much higher in seeds where you're required to beat the Shadow Temple. Serenade is a quick way to reach Lake Hylia, but you'll probably only end up going there a couple of times each run. It also works well as kind of a welfare prelude of light because you can just use the owl to get to the market entrance. The downside is that this strat only works during the daytime. The last 3 songs all unlock a small amount of checks. I value Song of Time the highest because although it's only specifically required for 2 checks, it can give you access to several other locations such as the Stardust Forest Temple. Saria's only unlocks a couple checks, and they're worse to backtrack to than the Sun Song Grave. Sun Song is really nice for beginners to be able to route day or night cycles and things such as skulls easier, so you might weight Sun Song higher than I do just based on that alone. With that out of the way, let's talk about some other stuff. A big mistake that I see a lot of players make is not prioritizing their progression dungeons when they have the means to clear or access them, opting to do other checks throughout the world instead. The first time you go adult, you should check the stone in the Temple of Time to see specifically which dungeons give you which medallions, because that's extremely important information for completing the run. When you have all the required items to full clear a dungeon that gives you a medallion, it's the right choice to clear that dungeon 100% of the time, and when you find something that lets you clear one, you should go there right after you finish whatever area you're currently checking. There are a couple of exceptions to this rule though, Water and Fire. If you can full clear either of these 2 dungeons early, it's not necessarily a good idea to do so because both of them are not very linear and you might not need to go further than 1 or 2 checks to find the boss key. I usually try to leave Fire and Water for the last of my known progression choices, so when I run out of other things to do, then I'll go to them. Ideally, you'll find your other items for Gomo before you ever need to enter Water or Fire, so you can just find the boss key and then just beat the dungeon without having to waste your time on all the other stuff throughout the dungeon. Prioritizing progression also means checking dungeons that you can partially clear and not fully clear. Since you'll inevitably have to do this anyway, it's good to do it sooner rather than later, even if it results in you going to a specific dungeon multiple times. When you don't have progression to focus on, you should be focusing on your efficiency with checks, which mainly means prioritizing locations that have a lot of check density. Usually what I'll do when I'm searching for an important item is to think of a location that has a lot of checks available to me, and balance it with quick checks I can do while I travel there, and also the amount of time it'll take me to reach that location. So after I decide on a location, I decide on the next location I should go to in case my first choice doesn't pay off, once again balancing it with the amount of time it'll take to get there and the checks I can do on the way. I continue this chain until I find something useful and then just go from there. In a nutshell, you should go to locations that 1, you can access quickly, and 2, have a decent amount of checks. Gossip Stone hints are also very important in the case that you find the Stone of Agony, because hints lead to more knowledge or progression, which can either be confirming things that you have to do, or confirming things that you don't have to do. Backtracking kind of goes hand in hand with efficiency, because the more you leave yourself open to potential backtracking later in the run, the more time you'll have to waste heading back to each location you leave open. This can end up being really punishing sometimes because many of the locations in OOT take several minutes to get to, and it's even worse when you have to travel back and forth between child and adult a lot. Sometimes this is unavoidable, but you can often save yourself from having to backtrack to an area later by putting that area off for a little while, and hopefully you'll find the means to do the rest of the checks in that area from other places first. Another thing to keep in mind is what's called save scumming. Save scumming is simply saving before using an important but limited resource to check something, and resetting if you don't find anything useful at that check to get your resources back. Usually this is done with either bomb chews before you find a bomb bag, or small keys. Some places that I like to save scum keys are in GTG to check the 3 chests on the right side of the maze area, Child Spirit, and the Water Temple. Lastly, just a little bit about Skulltulas. Skulls are not super important to collect, but many seeds require an item from them. So, at the very least, pushing to 10 or 20 skulls pretty fast to check their rewards is usually a good play, and doesn't require you to go that far out of your way to collect them. Personally, I collect skulls all throughout the run until I either reach go mode or find hints telling me that I don't need to get any more. Sometimes this results in me having, like 30 or 40 plus skulls that didn't lead me to anything, but it's just a safe play. It's important to keep in mind that skulls are not nearly as valuable as normal checks, so you shouldn't be going out of your way to collect skulls unless you have a hint. Routing skulls can be really hard as a new player, but the more randomizers you do and the more practice you get, the easier it is to collect them efficiently. Alright, let's move into the second section of the video, which is a bit more advanced, and we'll talk about routing in a lot more detail. So these are the 3 phases of Randomizer: the early game, the mid game, and the late game. We talked a bit about prioritizing progression and efficiency in the first section, so now we'll see how that plays into each part of the run. One thing to know about how the randomizer works is that the less you require to reach a certain check, the more likely it is to be an item that will be your first source of progression. As a check starts to be locked behind more and more items to reach them, the chances of it being something important drops because all of the important items you've already obtained to reach that are now out of the pool. So that being said, this points to the child section being incredibly strong in the early game of Randomizer because child has so many checks that require 0 items to reach. For actual proof of this, you can check the description below to view a couple spreadsheets in which some players generated thousands of seeds to see how often each check was required to beat the game. So my standard opening route gets the sword chest, Mido's house, and then immediately leaves the forest to go to the market, and then I farm some money from the bridge. From here you have a couple options that I believe are ideal, but both of them involve going adult to get the song at the windmill in Kirkq. I know some players are against the idea of going adult early, and I actually was too for a while, but I think it just makes so much sense to go grab the song given how valuable they are. I don't really think there are any songs in the game that I consider to be a bust from the windmill, even ones such as, Song of Time, Sun Song, and Saria's Song, because they all prevent some backtracking later and open a few things up. On top of that, similar to most of Child, Adult Kirkq has a good amount of checks that require nothing, so they're good to pick up on your way to the song. Anyway, after clearing out Adult Kakariko and the graveyard, I save warp back to the Temple of Time and then go back Child. And after I do that, I'm usually Child for the next 45 minutes to an hour or so. Just kind of depends on how much I find as Child and how much I'm able to do. You can do this in 2 different ways. Both of them are fine and provide their own small benefits. The first route, the one that I normally do, farms a lot of rupees outside, uses it to buy sticks, a Hylian shield, and then I usually top off my rupees for my inevitable trip back to the Deku Tree and the rest of the forest. From here I get Richard the dog at night, then I get the ZL song location, and then I go adult, save warping back when I'm done in Kirkq. In this route you have more time to farm money, and I find that the day and night cycles work out better when you come back to Child, letting you do night Kirkq earlier. The other route you can do would be going adult when you first reach the market, then when you go back Child, farm a bit of money, get Richard, get ZL, and now both routes have synced up again. If you're not at full rupees, it's a good idea to get a good amount of them before leaving the market. If you don't like either of these 2 choices, I'm sure there are more variations of the style of routing that you can come up with that will work just fine, but regardless of how you want to route it, I strongly recommend always picking up the song from Adult Kirkq. From here, the route opens up a lot and you can do a ton of different things. The first is going to Child Kirkq and checking everything there, including starting on the mask trading quest, or going to the ranch for the song check and 2 other checks. You can also go to Gerudo Valley for the checks and the Scarecrow song down there. Either way, you should look to save warp back to the forest from a location where you find yourself kind of stuck, or one that's really slow to get anywhere. So, for example, the back of the ranch is really good, the Scarecrow's really good, or the open grotto outside Lake Hylia. I kind of switch it up every run, but the basic concept behind getting somewhere really far away and then save warping back to the forest is still always the same. The reason you want to go back to the forest is because you can clear out the Deku Tree and Lost Woods and get another song, all of which are very high priority things. Deku is a topic that I've seen a lot of people talk about, and this is my take on it. A lot of people like to clear it immediately, but I don't think that's a very efficient option unless in the case where you find like 80 or 90 rupees in your first 5 checks in the forest, because then you can afford a Deku Shield, some sticks, and some Deku Nuts to be able to clear it. At minimum, you only need a couple sticks if you know a setup for getting a broken Deku Stick, but it's a pretty good idea to just get some extra so you can collect a couple skulls while you're in there. If you go with the absolute minimum, you're still going to need a good amount of rupees to be able to clear Deku. So if you find a lot of rupees, that's great, but I think that farming rupees in the forest to be able to clear Deku is a mistake no matter how I look at it, really. Because farming from the bridge outside the market is not only a faster source of money, but it also causes time to pass, and you have to wait for night to get ZL anyway. Since you eventually have to come back to the forest to get a song, I think it's just a way better option to save warp back with a bunch of money and clear Deku Tree and Lost Woods in one go. Also, since the Deku Tree has a lot of checks that require nothing, I think it's always worth checking in full clearing, even if you know that it gives you a stone. It only takes an extra minute or 2 to finish the dungeon when you're in there getting all the checks, and if you do that, it's going to prevent you from ever having to come back in the case that your seed is an all-dungeon seed. So anyway, I get the forest checks, go farm money and clear the market, get ZL, get the windmill song, go back child, grab the ranch and anything else I want to get, then save warp back, clear Deku, and then clear the Lost Woods. At this point, it's usually around 25 or 30 minutes into the run, and I'm at 4 songs and a good amount of child completed. After this point though, I get whatever is left for me to get based on any items or songs that I find, trying to clear out as much of child as I can before going back adult. So some examples would be checking Child Spirit and the song if Requiem is found, doing Goron City and then Death Mountain Trail, going up to Zora's River if I find bombs, or doing the bottom of the well if Storms is found. After I've cleared out as much as I can in Child, I go back adult, and I now shift into the mid-game section of the run. In summary, the whole point of the early game is to check things that require little to no items as quickly and efficiently as you can, while also getting the starting songs on the way. After you've gotten all the songs and cleared most of Child, those things will generally be pointing you in the right direction to go next. Mid-game is the part of the run where I transition to almost exclusively progression for as long as possible. Of course, I still check things on the way to my required areas, but I never actually go out of my way to check an optional area like Ice or Gerudo Fortress, if I have the means to enter or clear a required dungeon. Really the only exception to this rule would be the Water Temple, or if I find some sort of hint or have a very strong reason to believe that I should be going to one of those optional areas. Song gathering is another important thing that I'll prioritize when I go back adult, because now with 4 songs and a bunch of checks, it's very likely that more song locations such as Bolero or Minuet are going to be reachable. I usually consider song checks to be about the equivalent of progression in the mid-game, but obviously ones that take a lot longer to reach are a lot less valuable. Usually by this point you'll have the means to full clear a dungeon or 2, but if you're really unlucky and you can't yet, you should still be able to enter and start working on some of your required dungeons or gather some more songs. While this almost always leads to double dipping and can feel pretty bad to do, it's a very good play to make because of the fact that you'll be working on clearing parts of the dungeons that you need to finish eventually anyway, and if you're lucky you'll find a source of progression while you're there. However, double dipping can be bad depending on how far you decide to dip into each dungeon, because there are some dungeons where it's just not a very efficient option. Here's a list of the dungeons, including how far I tend to go into them if I'm searching for items. If I completely run out of progression to do and songs to get, I sort of shift back into the early game style mentality where my goal is to check as many things as I can that require little to no items or places that are very condensed. Certain non-required dungeons are good sources for checks too. Here's a list of all the dungeons with how many real checks they have, meaning things other than small keys or the boss key. If you tend to play with maps and compasses on, just subtract 2 from each of these values. I consider Ice Cavern and Gerudo Training Grounds to be pretty big risks because they're big time commitments, and I'd say I generally weight them about the same overall. Ice Cavern and the surrounding area nets you a song, but less checks overall, and GTG is a bit longer of a time commitment, but has more overall checks. In Slow Ganon Seeds, where you're required to beat the trials and need more items, they're less of a risk because you just have more stuff that you need to finish. Either way, committing to one of these locations is a pretty big risk that will set you 15 or 20 minutes behind other racers if they don't pay off. Of course, they're not always a bad play, I'm just trying to emphasize the risk that you take by committing to either of them. Depending on what I think I need to continue the seed, I'll prioritize one over the other, so for example, guessing that going through the desert is my only means of going to the Spirit Temple, or thinking I need the song from Ice, but most of that really just comes down to guessing and just isn't super reliable. Keep in mind that for GTG, the logic requires you to have either Epona or the long shot, and also a combination of either the hookshot, bow, or hover boots. As a common example, let's say you have Epona's song but no hookshot, bow, or hover boots. That means it's not a very good idea to go there. Not only does the logic not want you to do it yet, but you won't be able to clear very much of GTG without any of those items. For a full list of other requirements for logic throughout the game, you can check the description for a spreadsheet made by Scatter. If I ever find an item needed to continue a progression dungeon while searching somewhere else, I'll usually just finish clearing the immediate area that I'm in, assuming it's not going to take too long or won't take me forever to get back to, then just drop all my other plans or ideas and go back to that progression dungeon. Just don't let yourself get sidetracked when you know that you have the means to continue progressing somewhere. Sometimes you can also read into the logic a little bit to determine what the seed might want you to do. So, for example, going into GTG, if you find Epona, the hookshot, and the bow early on or something like that. Just be careful with reading into it too much though. I've seen people try to form their routing based solely off what they think the logic wants them to do, and honestly I'm not sure if I've ever seen it pay off. It just leads to making a lot of unnecessary gambles or wrong decisions. I've seen a lot of people, including racers and viewers of other racers, speculate on what my playstyle and routing might be like, thinking that I must be really good at reading what the logic wants me to do, but I actually read into the logic very, very little when I play Randomizer. In summary, the mid-game is all about doing things that you know you have to do to complete the run before doing things that you think you have to do. When you run out of things that you know you have to do, then you can start doing things that you think the logic might be pushing you towards. Anyway, lastly we have the late game. This is the part of the game when you're maybe 2 or 3 items away from being able to complete the game. At this point, you've likely done all of your possible progression, so the only other thing you can do if you're still searching for an item is to go back to working on condensed, efficient checks wherever you can. Unfortunately, a lot of the late game is all about guessing correctly, whereas the early and middle game portions of the run tend to have many different options that can push you forward. Minimizing backtracking earlier in your run is super important for your late game, because if you find yourself in a situation where you have a bunch of areas with only 1 or 2 checks left in them, you have a much higher chance of guessing wrong and wasting a lot of time going from place to place. Reaching this phase of the run as fast as you can by focusing on doing all of your early and mid-game progression as soon as possible can provide you with a nice time advantage over other players. If you beat another racer to the end game by say 5 minutes, This means that you have a 5-minute advantage over them for guessing where your last items might be. Of course, this won't always be a super accurate comparison between how many total checks you or another player have done by this point, but it's still very nice to reach this spot before other players do. In this portion of the game, it's much more likely that things you've obtained very recently will point you to the place that you need to go, which is where the time advantage from reaching it quickly comes into play. It's really important to pay attention to your medallions because the Forest medallion unlocks the Prelude location, and the Forest, Fire, and Water medallions unlock the Nocturne location. If I've just unlocked those recently and I'm locked out of my other sources of progression, I'll usually rush to pick up any songs that I might be missing, and then think about how I can use those songs to find what I'm looking for. In some unlucky cases, you might need to do all the stone dungeons to unlock the Ocarina for another song, but I think that should always be a last resort unless you can finish them quickly or if you're able to determine what you need from a hint. If you're only missing the light arrows while you're playing on a fast Ganon seed, your priority should just be to rush the hint immediately and ignore everything else with very few exceptions. One good example would be to check the last few chests in a long dungeon like Shadow, even if you already have the boss key and the small key to reach Bongo. This might seem like an obvious thing for most people, but I've seen so many people fall into the trap of checking other locations that are out of the way before heading to the hint, which almost always ends up being a waste of time. Similar to knowing which dungeons you have to complete tells you how to progress, the hint is something that will guarantee you knowledge and tell you exactly what you need to do instead of guessing. One unique scenario I wanted to point out is that you can enter water with a combination of the long shot and gold scale, so if you don't have the iron boots, you're still able to access the dungeon. On top of that, if you have ZL and the Song of Time, you can check every single chest in the dungeon other than one, so it's very likely that you can clear the dungeon without iron boots a lot of the time. So in summary, for the late game, this part of the game is all about shifting back to making condensed and efficient checks, but you should try to prioritize things that you know you have found later into the seed. Okay, so now that the general routing and theory is out of the way, let's look at how to actually put all these things into action. I'm going to review my run from the first Randomizer weekly and walk you through all the choices I made throughout it. This is definitely going to be the longest part of the video, but I felt that it was really important to show off an actual full run to see how everything falls into place. So I started on the standard way I talked about earlier, which is getting the first 5 chests in the forest. The sword chest had a bottle, and Mito's house had a bomb bag and a hook shot, which is a ridiculously good opener in Randomizer. However, getting a lot of strong items near the start of the seed can sometimes be pretty tricky because you suddenly open up a ton more options, and it's a bit harder to find a direction. Anyway, from here, I just go to the market right away. Once I'm there, I farm some money from the bridge, and go immediately to the slingshot game. I didn't max out my rupees before this because of the off chance that the game gives more rupees, so I wouldn't be wasting them. After this, I go to the shop, buy a few sticks and deku nuts, and then grab the skulltula in the house, and then go back outside to farm more money. One thing to note is that I roll out of each jump or fall directly into the loading zone from the bridge, so I don't take any fall damage. If you do this enough times without doing either of those things, you're gonna either end up in crit health or just be really close to dead, and it's kinda scary. After getting a Hylian shield, I head back outside and get back up to 79 rupees, then just wait until night. Because I know that my next location is Adult Kirkq, I don't need any more money, and if I find more there, it would again be a waste, just like the slingshot game. Now I get the Richer check, which has the first strength upgrade, and the skulltula outside, then I go grab ZL, which gives Sunsong. After going adult, the first thing I do is check the stone and write down all the locations, which tells me exactly what I have to clear. This seed required Spirit, Forest, Fire, Shadow, and Water, and our freebie, so every single adult dungeon. Then I just clear out Adult Kirkq and the Graveyard. I actually completely forgot about the bombable grotto in Kirkq because I'm not used to getting bombs this early and was just kind of on autopilot, but thankfully it didn't end up being anything important that I could have used earlier in the run. The Windmill Song gave me Prelude, and after checking the Sun Song grave, I got my second strength upgrade. So at about the 15-minute mark of this race, I can already full clear Deku, full clear DC, access and enter the Forest and Fire Temple, and enter Adult Spirit, but I can't get there yet. However, just because I can do all these things doesn't mean that I should commit to them just yet. I still think it's a better decision to just head back Child, and that's what I ended up doing here. If I had found the bow as well, I probably would have just rushed Forest in this case, because that's already some progression I could have finished, and I might have found something. Back in Child, I go do Bomb Chew Bowling, and then go to Child Kirkq. I typically leave the man on the roof and the grotto behind the shops for Child, because I just end up closer to them while grabbing Kirkqs. The Kirkqs you already have in the pen will stay there if you enter a house or the grotto in Kirkq. So I gather the first half, then jump over the fence and just immediately go in the grotto. When I come back out, the one I use to get over the fence respawns next to the pen, so I can just quickly grab the last 3 Kirkqs and get the reward. In this case, it gives me the bow, which means that I can now full clear Forest. But again, just because I can full clear Forest super early doesn't mean it's the best option, especially because I already came back Child and have a ton of high priority checks left here. So in this case, I opt to stay Child, grabbing some bugs so that I can start collecting skulls, and then save warp back to the Temple of Time to grab the Keaton Mask. Now I go to the ranch and grab the song, which gives me Minuet. And after I grab the heart piece in the back of the ranch, I use Minuet to get the Saria song check. Sometimes I like to exit the ranch manually and head to Gerudo Valley from here, but in this race I decided against it. I actually regretted this decision later in the run though, because Gerudo Valley ended up having a scale, which would have been really nice to have later. So Saria gave me Requiem, which is a very, very good find, and that means GTG just became way less valuable. Because I don't have the means to check the chests in Child Spirit just yet though, I decided to not go get the song and save warp to clear Deku. Whenever I go to Spirit, I can also just use Prelude to go back to the Temple of Time faster, so it's not something I need to rush to do at this point, even though it gives a song. Because I was sitting on full rupees now, I bought a Deku Shield and some more sticks from the shop, but left myself a little bit of money so I wouldn't have to farm much, or anything at all, after Deku to check the Deku Salesman in the Lost Woods. Sometimes I like to save scum the first Deku Salesman on the left side of the Lost Woods if I don't have enough to check them both. Deku Tree was pretty nice and gave me a slingshot from the top floor, and also the Stone of Agony from Goma. It's important to note that because I got a slingshot, Goma was in logic, meaning the Stone of Agony is supposed to be found early in this seed. I'd say 95% of the time I end up killing Goma out of logic. Anyway, finding the stone this early usually means something long or tedious is required, so from this point on in the run, I decided to go slightly out of my way to get skulls until I found hints that say I don't need them anymore. The slingshot also gives me something to progress in Child Spirit, so that shifts Child Spirit to something I should do sooner rather than later. After Deku, I go into the Lost Woods and get the Deku Salesman on the left side, then warp to the desert, intending on save warping back to the forest later. I don't know exactly if this is optimal or not, it's probably not, but I just don't like going all the way back and climbing up the big ladder from the salesman on the left. At the desert, I get the skull and I check the Gossip Stone, which tells me that the Prelude location gives Serenade. I actually totally forgot about this hint later on in the run, and if I remembered it, it actually would have saved me a little bit of time when I knew when to go to water. Child Spirit has the Zora Tunic and a small key. Normally, after finding a small key, I tend to save scum Child Spirit, but because I already found silvers, I just save warp after the second chest and get the song. The song ended up being ZL, meaning I can get yet another free song from the graveyard. In this part of the run, I started making some really dumb mistakes that wasted a lot of time. Usually, by this point, I've done Child Kirkq twice, meaning I can grab the Skull Mask and check in the Lost Woods, but I didn't do the second trip, which ends up throwing me off multiple times in this run, like right here. I grab the Fairy Fountain by the castle and warp back to the Temple of Time, this time checking the Gossip Stones, but not before being dumb and trying to buy the Skull Mask a second time. So one of the Gossip Stone hints says that an immense cavern is on the way to the hero, which means that DC is required for some reason or another. These Way of the Hero hints are a little bit broken and can sometimes point to misleading or unnecessary items, but I find that more often than not they end up being helpful. I've heard that they're in the process of being fixed, so maybe by the time that this video is up they'll already be fixed. Anyway, in this case, I take the hint for what it's worth, and assume that DC is now a required dungeon. Now I decided to go to Nightcack and correct my mistake with the mask, and also grab Dampe, the Graveyard Song, and some skulls, but of course I forgot to hand in the mask again, which will lead to some dumb things later on. At this point, I have enough skulls for the 10 skull reward, so I grab it, and then I head to the graveyard for the Dampe check and get the song, which is Bolero, meaning I get yet another free song when I go back to Adult. From here, I save warp back to Link's house, checking everything else left in the forest, except Skull Mask, because my brain once again thought I already had it. After Lost Woods, I go to Goron City for the few checks in there, which are the Maze, the Rolling Goron, and the Goron Pot, which I can get using ZL. The Goron Pot ended up being Din's Fire, another requirement to enter in Beach Shadow. After this, I go out onto Death Mountain Trail for the check in the wall and the one on top of DC. I like doing these checks whenever I get explosives as child because it makes routing as adult a little bit easier, just not having to worry about doing an awkward loop around Death Mountain Trail. After getting the checks and the skull outside DC, I finally remember to hand in my Keaton mask, then I play Prelude and go adult. Normally, I like going down Zora's River and Zora's Domain when I find explosives, but because I already found so many sources of progression, I just went adult. So at almost exactly 1 hour into the run, this is where I transition my playstyle from the check as much stuff as I can early game into the prioritize required stuff mid game. Around an hour is usually very early for this to happen, but again, I had already found so much stuff. I'd say between an hour and 15 minutes to an hour and 30 minutes into the run is usually where I start working on clearing stuff. So anyway, the first thing I do is use Bolero to get the song Outside Fire, which is Saria's, and then get the other checks inside the crater and the fairy fountain outside. From here, I'm in a good spot to head directly to DC, so I go and full clear it because, again, due to the Gossip Stone hint, I was treating it as a required dungeon right now. The only thing DC has is the letter in a bottle, which to me means there are 3 possible scenarios at this point that will lead to completing this seed. Number 1, the letter is required for something inside Jabu. Number 2, the letter is required to reach Ice Cavern, something outside of it. And number 3, beating Jabu is required for the Ocarina of Time song, making this an all dungeon seed. 2 of them point to Jabu, and 1 of them points to Ice Cavern. Keep this in mind for later because some of my decision making revolves around these 3 possibilities and the hint telling me to go to DC. After DC, I immediately warp to Forest, which gives me Nocturne, meaning I can reach Shadow now, but I can't enter it until I have Magic, and I can't clear it until I find Hovers. Nocturne is really important to find, but it doesn't mean much until I get Magic somewhere, so I go into Forest and I full clear. Because I don't have Song of Time, I use a precise hookshot in the right side of the courtyard to be able to access every chest. I end up finding the Lens of Truth, Iron Boots, and Light Arrows in Forest. So after Forest, I can't full clear any more dungeons, but I still have the means to enter and check a lot of things in Fire, Spirit, and Water. If you want to take a guess as to what I end up doing next based on what I've said throughout this video, go ahead and I'll talk about a few other things first. Now, an hour and a half in, I've finished 1 required dungeon, 1 that I believe to be required, and 1 that is not required, but tends to have some valuable checks. This is pretty decent progress so far, but it doesn't mean a whole lot because I have to find something else very soon to be able to continue clearing dungeons. The lens doesn't mean a whole lot, but the Iron Boots let me go inside Water, one of my required dungeons, and the Light Arrows are obviously required to kill Ganondorf. So, if you guessed Spirit Temple, you're right because that's where I headed next to start checking stuff. The reason I picked Spirit is because, for starters, I found Silvers very early into the run, which can lead to Spirit being necessary for something early. I have a chance to get pretty far into Fire depending on how the keys are laid out, but a lot of the time, you need the hammer to continue past the first few rooms in Fire. On top of that, I also haven't found a Goron Tunic or a wallet, meaning Fire is technically not in logic for me. And I also didn't set up Scarecrow Song yet. Well, I didn't end up basing my decision on this at all. I thought it was important to point out. I have a Zora Tunic, but Water has very few checks that are actual items, and I'm not able to access some of the checks because I don't have the Longshot, Hover Boots, or Song of Time. Water and fire are both possible to clear and ignore the rest of if you find the boss key early, which is always ideal when you have to do them. Spirit has a ton of checks, and while I'm not able to get all of them yet because I don't have magic or the mirror shield, I can still work on clearing out a dungeon that I know I will have to progress through a decent amount to reach the boss anyway. So after checking everything in Adult Spirit, I found all the small keys but not the boss key, meaning it's locked behind magic or the mirror shield. Alternatively, I could either go back to Child and get the 2 fire checks using a stick, or use different strats to light torches by standing on top of stuff and shooting arrows through the torches that have fire. I checked all of Adult Side and found nothing, so I went Child intending on doing the torch strat in the main room for the check there, but as my last check before that, I find hover boots in the silver gauntlet chest on Child side. Finding hovers puts me a magic meter away from being able to enter and clear Shadow, so magic is suddenly the most important item that I can possibly find. This changes my priority so that the last 2 checks in Spirit aren't as important to me, and while this could have ended up being an extremely bad play, I didn't want to deal with the time commitment of doing both the checks I had left in there in the most inefficient way possible. Instead, I just go to the fairy fountain in the desert and go back Child. While I could have went to either fire or water, which are both progression, I was hoping to find the hammer, longshot, or both, so I could just clear them real quick and be out of there. Also, at this point, I still had the DC is required hint in my mind from the Gossip Stone, which again, gave me the letter. Going back to the 3 options I talked about earlier, I haven't found the boomerang, which means Jabu is off the table, but I did find the iron boots, meaning I can go to the ice cavern with the means to full clear the area, making it a lot more appealing to do, so I wouldn't have to worry about any backtracking. Picking up another song is always nice too. Back as Child, I started heading to Zora's Domain with the intention of also checking Gerudo Valley, grabbing the Scarecrow and some of the grottos in Southern Hyrule Field, and also going back to Kokiri Forest to check Skull Mask and the Saria Song locations. But stuff started going south here because I realized I forgot to pick up the Skull Mask again. This shouldn't really have been a big deal at all, but when I was starting to go up Zora's River to grab the beans and the other checks on the way up, I lost my Kirkq near the top and started getting on tilt a bit. I thought I lost my means for getting into Zora's Domain, forgetting about ZL existing, so instead of going all the way back down the river to bring another Kirkq up there, I just would go grab the Skull Mask and go to Gerudo and set up the Scarecrow first. This was obviously a really bad heat-of-the-moment decision, but as it would turn out, Gerudo Valley actually had a scale, so after the Scarecrow, I just swam into Zora's Domain. In Zora's Domain, just past an hour and 50 minutes, I found a Gossip Stone that told me 40 skulls had the Mirror Shield. I was already at 29 from collecting them throughout the whole run, so I wasn't too far off, but finding this hint confirmed my decision to go to Ice Cavern because I could grab a lot of skulls on the way there and inside of it. The Mirror Shield was an especially important item in this case because the Spirit Temple gave the Forest Medallion in this save, which would give another song. I totally forgot about the hint earlier, as I mentioned before, which told me that the song was Serenade, which wouldn't have been important at all, but because I forgot, I wanted to get Mirror Shield right away so I could go and beat Spirit. After clearing out Zora's Domain, I warped to plant beans at Fire and Spirit. Fire normally wouldn't make any sense at all, given that I just recently found hovers, but I used my bugs to get a skull from the soil while I was there. Ultimately, I decided to not even bother with the Saria checks or Skull Mask check because I had a confirmed source of progression again, which is kind of funny because after all that I went through to finally get my Skull Mask, I didn't even bother checking it. Oh yeah, I was pretty lucky that this chest had nothing too. So I went back to Adult and then immediately went up the river to get to Ice, getting all the skulls on the way there. Ice had the hammer inside, meaning Fire was now on the table to full clear, but when I unthawed King Zora, I found a magic meter, so then I just instantly went to Shadow Temple. Shadow is a way better option than Fire in general because it's very linear, and things also worked out very nicely with skulls because by the time I finished Shadow, I'd be over 40 and then I could just run into Kirkq and grab the Mirror Shield. This also meant that the last item I needed for Go Mode was Longshot. So I cleared out Shadow, grabbed all my skulls in there, and the Longshot was in there. So 2 hours and 26 minutes into the run, I had Go Mode. After Shadow, I got the Mirror Shield, then ran to Water so I could go grab the Scarecrow before doing Fire just in case. So this would have been the point where remembering that Serenade was at the Prelude location would have been nice, but because I forgot about it, I just backwalked across Hyrule Field like an idiot. The boss key was in literally the first chest I checked in water, so I was in and out of there in only a couple minutes, and after that I went to Spirit, finished it off, and then went to Fire, and the boss key in Fire was about halfway up the dungeon. Then I just went back and beat Ganon, and that was the Seed, ending with 302-23. Overall, I thought the Seed was pretty easy, and I didn't really play that well execution-wise, and made a lot of mistakes too. I just made a lot of writing decisions that made sense to me given the information that I had access to within the game, and focus on doing all those things. While the Seed was easy, I thought it was a great representation of choosing the correct options that are open to you, and using all the resources available to you, like Son of Agony, to find information and clear the Seed faster. Anyway, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching, and good luck.